Yeah, so Edgar Allan Poe, he was a very interesting guy. Hi, welcome to Crash Course. I'm Alex Green, and today we will be discussing Edgar Allan Poe. First off, Edgar Allan Poe was very famous. He was a famous American writer, critic, and editor. And some facts about him: he was born January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, and his life came to an end on October 7th, 1849. 1827 was the year that he published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, and this was actually published during his time which he was serving in the army. He was famous, and one of his quotes was, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world." This was probably clearly demonstrated in Poe's life, because later on he went to marry a woman that he loved very much, and we'll get into that later on. But first off, John Allan was the father of Poe, and this man wanted Poe to grow up to become a businessman just like he was, and didn't really support his literary career. It was later on that Poe went and moved in with his Aunt Maria Clem and met Virginia, the woman, or it was his cousin, which he later on got to marry when she was still 13 years old. In 1835, Poe was hired as a literary critic, in which he was a very harsh critic when examining other people's works. And in 1841, he launched a new genre of detective fiction. So successful was Poe that he became known as the father of the detective story, and was very famous for being innovative towards the science fiction genre.
Mr. Green, what are some of his famous works?
That's a good question, Alex. Well, one of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous works was The Gold Bug, which was published in 1843. Also, Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841. And one of the most famous works published by Edgar Allan Poe was in 1845, the poem known as The Raven. The poem starts off with a narrator sitting quietly in his chair. He's reading a book when all of a sudden he hears a strange tapping sound coming from his door. The narrator comes to the conclusion that there is only a visitor, but once he goes to check, there's nobody at the door. Later on, he hears the exact same tapping sound coming this time from the window. Once he goes to check the window, there's a raven perched outside, and it immediately flies in. The narrator begins to question the raven, asking it what are its intentions. But the raven only answers with one simple word: nevermore. This is the moment where the narrator loses control of himself. He lets his grief take the better of him, because he is reminded of his wife, which he had lost, a wife named Lenore. He wants to know if he will ever be able to see Lenore again, and therefore begins to ask the raven of this. But the raven once again responds with the word nevermore. The narrator grows outraged with the bird, but even after kicking it out, the raven never leaves but remains perched outside his home. Now let's go on to analyze Poe's most famous poem. The Gothic setting stays true to Poe's writing Gothic style because it is set in December and at midnight, which gives us an idea of the Gothic setting and the style that Poe was used to writing in. The entire tone of the poem is very melancholic. This is because we notice, as we saw in the poem, the narrator is lamenting and grieving over his lost wife, Lenore. It is very likely that Poe was comparing the emotions of that narrator to his own emotions that he had felt when he had lost his own wife, Virginia, whom we had discussed earlier. Later on in the poem, we realize how the narrator becomes agitated by the bird, because the bird keeps telling him that he will never ever, or nevermore, be able to see his wife again, and therefore the narrator feels mocked by the raven's expressions. So, what are some of the themes we can analyze in The Raven? Well, one of those is loss, because of the death of the narrator's wife. Also supernatural, because the bird is able to communicate with the narrator. And finally, regret, because the narrator desperately wants to see his wife Lenore again. Very interesting how the character of the narrator is fleshed out in the poem. Throughout most of the poem, the narrator at first is calm and in a depressed state about losing his wife Lenore. However, once the raven is introduced into the poem, and once the raven begins to tell him that he will never see Lenore again, that's when he becomes outraged and loses his temper with the bird. Although The Raven was very successful, there were a few critics who defamed Edgar Allan Poe's work. Why was this? Well, it was for the simple reason that many people thought that he had actually plagiarized and copied the story from another story that had already existed at his time. One example of this was a story from Charles Dickens titled Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, which also contained a similar bird, or a raven, and many people believe that he had copied the raven in this story to make it his own. Later on, a friend of Poe called Thomas Chivers claimed that Poe's raven was actually plagiarized, and in fact, Thomas Chivers claimed that he himself had created it and he had inspired Poe to write it. Overall, Poe was a revolutionary American author that changed the course of American literature with his unique Gothic style of writing. His revolutionary use of the deepest, darkest parts of his mind translated into some of the greatest American literature that we have ever seen. I'm Alex Green. Until next time.
So that concludes today's episode of Crash Course. Tune in never, because this is the end of our YouTube career. We're done. This is too hard.